Death is a part of life, but some deaths are more horrifying than others. In this video, we'll explore 5 real stories of the worst deaths in human history. These are not just stories. They are grim reminders of how fragile life can be and how brutal the end can sometimes be. It was November 25, 1988, in Saitama, Japan. Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old high school student, was biking home after school when her life took a tragic turn. Junko was known for her friendly personality and hard-working nature. She had dreams of becoming a singer and was saving money for a graduation trip while studying for her exams. But that evening, her routine ride home would change everything. Around 8:30 p.m., Junko was approached by 2 classmates, Hiroshi Miyano and Shinji Minato. Miyano had a reputation for disruptive behavior, while Minato had ties to criminal activities and gang-related violence. Miyano had taken a romantic interest in Junko, but after she rejected him, he became dangerously obsessed. That night, Miyano orchestrated a plan to trap her. Minato knocked her off her bike and fled, while Miyano pretended to help her. Instead of escorting her home, he lured her to an abandoned warehouse, where he assaulted her. Afterward, Miyano called Minato and bragged about his actions. Soon, 2 other classmates, Joe Ogura and Yasushi Watanabe, joined them. These boys, who were part of a gang, had a history of criminal behavior. Together, they decided to hold Junko captive for their own gratification. By the early hours of November 26th, Junko was taken to Minato's home. They manipulated her into calling her parents, claiming she had run away but was safe. To avoid suspicion, the boys made her act as Minato's girlfriend whenever his parents were around. However, Minato's parents soon realized what was happening, but chose not to involve the police, fearing retaliation from the criminal group the boys were affiliated with. For the next 40 days, Junko endured unimaginable suffering. She was assaulted, beaten, and tortured daily. The boys invited others to participate, with nearly 100 people reportedly involved over the weeks. Junko was subjected to cruel treatment, including being burned, forced to ingest harmful substances, and exposed to extreme cold. Despite her worsening condition, her captors showed no mercy. Junko's physical injuries were severe. Her body was covered in burns and bruises, her brain was affected by repeated trauma, and she was unable to move or speak coherently. At one point, she managed to contact the police, but before she could explain her situation, she was caught and punished harshly. Her captors ignored her pleas for the suffering to end and continued their abuse. By early January 1989, Junko was on the brink of death. Her injuries were so severe that her body began to decompose while she was still alive. Her captors, growing bored and angry, eventually decided to end her life in one final act of violence. On January 4th, Miyano poured lighter fluid on her and set her on fire. Too weak to defend herself, Junko succumbed to her injuries. Her body was placed in a 55-gallon drum filled with cement and disposed of in Koto, Tokyo. The crime came to light when Miyano and Ogura were arrested later that month for a separate crime. During questioning, Miyano revealed the location of Junko's body. Police recovered her remains and the suspects were arrested. However, the legal outcome shocked many. The boys were not charged with homicide, but with bodily injury resulting in death due to their status as minors. This led to lenient sentences. Miyano received 20 years, while the others served between 5 to 9 years. These sentences sparked public outrage. After serving their sentences, the perpetrators continued their criminal behavior. Miyano became involved in fraud, and others were arrested for various offenses in later years. The injustice of Junko's case led to debates in Japan about juvenile law and changes to the age of criminal responsibility. Junko Furuta's story is a heartbreaking account of cruelty and a reflection of systemic failures. It left a lasting impact on her family, who fought for justice even after her death. While reforms have been made, questions remain about whether true justice was ever achieved. It was September 30th, 1999, in Tokaimura, Japan, a small town about 70 miles northeast of Tokyo. On this day, workers at a uranium processing facility were performing routine tasks. Unbeknownst to them, a series of errors would result in one of the most devastating nuclear accidents in modern history. The facility, operated by Japan Nuclear Fuel Conversion Company, or JCO, processed uranium for nuclear reactors. That day, 3 workers, Hisashi Ouchi, Masato Shinohara, and Yutaka Yokokawa, were preparing uranium-enriched fuel to meet a shipping deadline. To save time, they bypassed standard safety procedures, unknowingly setting off a chain of events that would forever change their lives. Instead of following strict safety guidelines, the workers transferred uranium using stainless steel buckets into a precipitation tank not designed for this purpose. The tank had a safety limit of 2.4 kilograms of uranium, but they poured in 16.6 kilograms, an amount far exceeding the limit. This triggered a critical incident, an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction, resulting in the release of deadly radiation. At around 10:30 a.m., a blue-white flash of light appeared, a visible sign of the chain reaction. Radiation flooded the room, exposing the workers to lethal doses. Ouchi, the closest to the tank, absorbed 17 sieverts of radiation, more than double the amount typically fatal. Shinohara received 10 sieverts, and Yokokawa, who was farther away, was exposed to 3 sieverts. For context, exposure to just 4 to 5 sieverts is usually fatal. The immediate effects were devastating. The workers became nauseous, disoriented, and suffered severe pain. Ouchi began vomiting uncontrollably. Their bodies had already started to break down due to the radiation's destructive effects on cells. Emergency alarms blared and the plant was evacuated. Local authorities quickly began efforts to contain the crisis, and the 3 workers were rushed to a hospital in Tokyo. Despite medical intervention, the damage was irreversible. Ouchi's suffering was particularly harrowing. The radiation destroyed his immune system and caused his skin to deteriorate severely. His organs began to fail, and his white blood cell count dropped to nearly 0, leaving him vulnerable to infections. Despite his pleas, doctors continued resuscitating him whenever his heart stopped, as his family insisted on ongoing treatment. After enduring 83 days of unimaginable pain, Ouchi passed away on December 21, 1999, from multiple organ failure. Shinohara, though less exposed, also succumbed to the effects of radiation after months of treatment. He died on April 27, 2000. Yokokawa, who had received a lower dose, survived after months of hospitalization but faced long-term health issues. The incident didn't just affect the workers. Over 10,000 people in the surrounding area were tested for radiation exposure, with 667 individuals found to have been exposed above safety limits. Though most were not severely affected, fear of contamination spread among residents, leading to panic and economic repercussions for the local community. The company faced severe legal and financial consequences. Yokokawa and other employees were charged with negligence, and in 2001, Yokokawa pled guilty to professional misconduct. The company was ordered to pay $121 million in compensation and was banned from operating nuclear facilities in Japan. The accident also prompted the Japanese government to strengthen safety regulations for nuclear plants. Classified as a Level 4 event on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the Tokemura disaster exposed critical flaws in the nuclear industry. The plant was permanently closed, and the incident severely damaged public trust in nuclear power. Although reforms were introduced, critics argued they didn't go far enough to prevent future disasters. The Tokemura accident remains one of the most haunting nuclear disasters in history. It highlights the devastating consequences of ignoring safety protocols and the profound impact of radiation exposure on the human body. For Hisashi Ouchi, who endured the highest recorded dose of radiation ever, his story is a reminder of the human cost of such tragedies. It was March 19, 2015, in Kabul, Afghanistan. Farkhunda Malikzada, a 27-year-old woman, left her home to attend a Quran reciting class. She was a volunteer teacher and a student of Islamic law, aspiring to become a judge. That morning, she assured her mother, Bibi Hajera, that she would help prepare for Afghan New Year celebrations upon her return. But Farkhunda never made it back. On her way home, she stopped at the Shado Shamshira Mosque, where a heated argument unfolded between her and Zainuddin, the shrine's caretaker. Farkhunda opposed the sale of amulets, viewing them as superstitious and against Islamic teachings. Frustrated by the disagreement, Zainuddin falsely accused her of disrespecting the Quran. His loud accusation quickly drew attention and a crowd gathered, fueled by outrage. Farkhunda vehemently denied the claim, repeatedly asserting her faith as a Muslim and her respect for the Quran. Despite her protests, the mob refused to listen. The false accusation spread rapidly, fueling the crowd's escalating anger. The situation escalated and the crowd became violent. Farkhunda was dragged out of the mosque and attacked with sticks and stones. Police arrived but did little to intervene. Instead of protecting her, they fired warning shots into the air and struggled to control the enraged mob. At one point, officers moved Farkhunda to the mosque roof, likely to shield her. But the mob hurled objects at her from below. Struck and weakened, she fell back into the crowd, where the violence intensified. The mob dragged Farkhunda into the street, where she was beaten severely. A car ran over her body, dragging her along the road. Her attackers then pulled her to the Kabul River, where they continued the brutal assault. Finally, they set her body on fire, with some members of the crowd using their clothing to feed the flames when her body resisted burning. The horrific event was captured on cell phones and shared online, sparking widespread outrage in Afghanistan and internationally. The footage revealed a horrifying reality. The attack was not carried out by extremists, but by everyday citizens driven by false accusations and a lack of understanding. President Ashraf Ghani condemned the act as heinous, and investigations were launched. Kabul's chief criminal investigator, General Mohammad Zahir, confirmed that no evidence existed to support the claim against Farkhunda. She had been falsely accused. Despite initial statements from some religious leaders defending the mob's actions, the truth eventually came to light. Farkhunda was innocent. The attack was a result of misinformation, societal misogyny, and mob violence. The brutality of Farkhunda's death became a turning point. Thousands of Afghans took to the streets in protest, uniting under the shared declaration that they stood with Farkhunda. Women's rights activists painted their faces red to symbolize her bloodied image. Her funeral was a historic moment as women carried her coffin, a powerful statement in a society where such roles are typically reserved for men. Justice, however, proved elusive. Of the 49 individuals initially charged, 4 were sentenced to death, and others received lengthy prison terms. Yet appeals reduced many sentences, and several defendants were released on bail. This leniency angered activists and Farkhunda's family, who felt justice had not been served. Farkhunda's death became a rallying cry for women's rights in Afghanistan. The street where she was killed was renamed in her honor, and her grave became a site of remembrance. Her story sheds light on the dangers women face in societies where deeply ingrained biases and misinformation can lead to such tragedies. For her mother, Bibi Hajera, the grief was unbearable. She remembered identifying her daughter's body, burned and battered. Despite her pain, she stood strong, participating in the historic funeral procession alongside other women. While Farkhunda's death exposed the harsh realities faced by Afghan women, it also ignited conversations about change. Her name remains a symbol of resilience and the fight against injustice, reminding the world of the work still needed to protect women's rights and challenge societal norms. It was August 16, 2003, at the Island County Fair on Whidbey Island, Washington. The fair was lively, with families enjoying the warm summer afternoon, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy filling the air. Children eagerly lined up for rides, and one of the highlights was the Super Loop 2, a small roller coaster with a single vertical loop. Operated by Paradise Amusements, a family-run business, this ride had been a fair favorite for 3 years. Doug McKay, a 40-year-old co-owner of Paradise Amusements, was working on maintaining the rides that day. Doug and his wife, Sherry, had been running their carnival business for years. Doug had grown up in the industry, starting as a child selling popcorn, and eventually becoming responsible for managing and maintaining rides. His experience and dedication to the family business were well known. That afternoon, Doug noticed the Super Loop 2 needed lubrication on part of its track. Maintenance like this was routine, but what happened next was not. Doug decided to address the issue while the ride was still operating, with passengers on board. Confident in his expertise, he climbed onto the platform of the ride to perform the task. Unfortunately, this decision turned tragic. While applying lubricant, Doug lost his footing and slipped. His long hair became entangled in one of the moving passenger carts. The cart, traveling at high speed, pulled Doug into the air, dragging him along the ride's track. Witnesses reported seeing him being lifted as high as 40 feet, colliding with parts of the ride before being thrown to the ground. Doug's body struck a metal fence, and he did not survive the fall. The horrifying accident unfolded in front of numerous fairgoers, including children riding the Superloop 2 at the time. Many of them witnessed the tragic event up close, leaving them deeply shaken. Some children were even covered in blood during the incident, a traumatic experience for all involved. Parents rushed to comfort their kids, and some, like Rob Volz, whose 12-year-old son Dylan was on the ride, took their children home to clean them up before they could be questioned by police. Law enforcement interviewed the children who were on the ride, but the process frustrated some parents. They felt it was insensitive to question the young witnesses before allowing them to recover from the ordeal. Meanwhile, the fairgrounds, initially silent after the incident, resumed activities within an hour. However, the Superloop 2 was immediately shut down and never operated again. Despite the tragedy, Sherry McKay honored a promise she had made to Doug to keep their business running. The next day, all other rides resumed operations, except for the Superloop 2. The carnival continued, but the loss of Doug was deeply felt by his family and crew. He was remembered as a tough but caring mentor who had dedicated his life to the carnival industry. Details of Doug's accident were devastating. Authorities speculated that his long hair or another part of his body became entangled in the ride. Witness accounts varied, with some reporting his arm or hair being caught. Doug sustained severe injuries from the initial impact of the ride and further trauma from the fall. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but he had already passed away. The state authorities did not pursue charges or safety regulation changes following the incident. Since Doug was a business owner and not an employee, the case fell outside their jurisdiction. Despite the lack of formal consequences, the accident showed the risks involved in operating and maintaining carnival rides. Doug McKay left behind his wife, Sherry, and their 3 children, Travis, Michelle, and Kelsey. His loss profoundly impacted his family, friends, and colleagues. Doug's funeral was held on August 26, 2003, at Calvary Chapel, Lake City in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Loved ones gathered to honor the memory of a man who had devoted his life to his family and the carnival business. Doug's tragic death remains a reminder of how critical safety precautions are in high-risk work environments, even for seasoned professionals. His passing left a void in the industry and among those who knew and admired him. On March 24, 1944, in Alkaloo, South Carolina, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr., an African-American boy, was playing outside with his younger sister, Amy. The siblings were approached by 2 white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames. The girls were looking for wildflowers and asked George and Amy for help. The siblings didn't know where to find them, so the girls moved on. That evening, Betty and Mary didn't return home, prompting a community-wide search. George and his family joined the effort, with George mentioning he had seen the girls earlier that day. The following morning, the girls' bodies were discovered in a shallow ditch, having suffered violent injuries. Soon after, George was accused of being responsible for their deaths. The local sheriff claimed that George confessed to the crime during questioning, allegedly admitting to using a blunt object and expressing inappropriate intentions toward one of the girls. However, this confession was neither written nor formally recorded. There were no witnesses or physical evidence connecting George to the incident, yet he was quickly arrested as the primary suspect. George's arrest set in motion one of the most troubling examples of injustice in the history of the United States. At 14 years old, George was small and frail, standing 5 feet 1 inch and weighing only 95 pounds. He was questioned alone for hours without a parent or lawyer present. The police reported a confession, but it was unclear if it was given voluntarily or under pressure. George's trial began less than a month later on April 24, 1944. It lasted only 3 hours. His court-appointed attorney, a tax lawyer with no criminal experience, offered no defense. There was no investigation into George's alibi, no challenge to the lack of evidence, and no witnesses called to support him. The all-white jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before finding him guilty. George was sentenced to death. The trial's atmosphere was hostile, with African Americans barred from the courtroom, which was packed with an all-white audience. The legal system failed George at every step. His family was forced to flee town due to threats, leaving George alone and defenseless. On June 16, 1944, less than 2 months after his conviction, George was executed by electric chair. At 14, he was the youngest person in the modern history of the United States to face such a punishment. The chair, built for adults, was far too large for his small frame. Officers placed a Bible under him to raise him. Straps meant to secure him hung loose, and the face mask was too big. Witnesses described the scene as horrifying, with the mask slipping off during the execution, revealing the terrified face of a child. George's death devastated his family, who lived with the pain and fear caused by threats and discrimination. For decades, his case was largely ignored, but his family and supporters never gave up hope of clearing his name. In 2004, renewed legal efforts began to seek justice for George. Civil rights activists argued he had been denied a fair trial and that his constitutional rights were violated. In December 2014, a South Carolina Circuit Court judge vacated George's conviction, ruling that his trial had been a failure of justice. The judge cited the lack of legal representation, the absence of an investigation, and a coerced confession as reasons for overturning the verdict. This ruling brought some closure to George's family, who had fought tirelessly to clear his name. George's sister, Katherine Robinson, viewed the decision as a bittersweet victory, feeling both relief at the long-awaited acknowledgement and sorrow as she thought of the helplessness George faced at the time. George Stinney Jr.'s story reveals the deep injustices of the legal system in the segregated South. His case is an example of the harm caused by racial prejudice and a failure to uphold justice. Though his name has been cleared, the tragedy of his short life and wrongful death lingers as a call to ensure fairness for all, especially for those who cannot defend themselves.